In this paper, I argue that we ought to be supporting more strongly than ever the expectation that no matter a country's internal uncertainties or instabilities, it ought to abide by its international legal obligations. And of course, that would include an expectation that the United States must do so also, even though there's a lot of opposition in the United States to that position. I had been very skeptical of international law, thinking that it just reflects the interests of the powerful and doesn't have a whole lot to contribute to thinking about the normative issues. But I found it much more helpful than I had expected from a normative point of view, and more helpful than most of what philosophers were writing around that time about military intervention. In the meantime, the responsibility to protect, or R2P, has become an international normative principle intended to guide states on their responsibilities. And of course, it conflicts with the traditional assumptions on which international order, such as it is, has been based. The assumption that states should respect each other's sovereignty and not interfere in their internal affairs. So working out this conflict between a responsibility to protect, which suggests we may have to interfere, and respecting sovereignty, working out this conflict is an ongoing problem, but it is being addressed within the international law community. And it is being addressed from the point of view of law and morality. And I conclude that international law has a great deal to recommend it in providing guidance on what our moral positions on international affairs ought to be. I think it's much more helpful than just taking moral theory and taking moral theory straight and clamping it down on international problems. I've tried to think about whether what I argue is a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach, and I think it's hard to say. Some international law is proclaimed in foundational documents like the UN Charter, but since there is not any central global power to bring about top-down results, and international law depends so heavily on agreement and consent and practice, and the willingness of populations to have their states go along with it, it resembles bottom-up processes quite a bit.
You seem to suggest that the ethics of care has some kind of compatibility with new doctrines in international law, like the responsibility to protect, which itself, is very controversial. So this is then, what I would like to summarize and say. Are you not basically, on the one hand, saying law is a limited domain from the perspective of care and interdependence and the perspective of the human infant, and not just the human infant, but everything that goes along with the activities of caring, which is more than just, mothering. It is also caring for the sick and the elderly. Fine, that's one perspective. But then you also seem to want to say that the ethics of care is compatible with or helps us think about some of these new developments in international law, and you single out responsibility to protect. And I will just end by saying that I'm not quite sure where that argument is going. I mean, there is a great deal of debate about responsibility to protect, period, but I guess I'm more interested in the sort of the logic of your argument, the way in which the two parts of the paper come together, and then we can take up responsibility to protect independently if others so wish. But I greatly enjoyed the papers.
Two people who are close friends might play a competitive game. If they're playing tennis on the court, they are trying to win against each other. They are playing for themselves. They are acting as self-interested individuals on the tennis court. But that's a small part of the relation between them. If they're close friends, they would not have that attitude towards their entire relation, or they wouldn't be very good friends. If they're just in it for what's in it for me, if they're just motivated by self-interest throughout their relation, they're not going to be really good friends. But within that relation of friendship at a deeper level or a more fundamental level, they can have competitive interactions, yes. So within these caring relations of a much more tenuous, distant kind, that can form the sort of basis on which to have social relations at all, to have people who think of themselves as part of a society and they can come up with a state. There have been lots of people not influenced by the ethics of care who pointed out not just any collection of people can form a state. They have to have some degree of social cohesion, of unity as a group before they can formulate institutions that will constitute a state.
In describing the ethics of care, you do associate it, I think, very appropriately with a feminist approach. And I did think, and I'm very glad Carol was able to come today, I was thinking about in another voice, because partly what you do is challenge the both Hobbesian but also Kantian notion that we start just with individual self-interest and then try to find a way through rational calculation that self-interest gives us some sort of justice, some sort of group norms, and that has been the way in which traditionally both national laws and morals as well as international laws achieve, by trying to show the relationship between individual interest and individual freedom and the kind of rational choices when you think of others who are equally free and how it might impact on them. That's how we get there. That's the Kantian term that is so effective. But it's rooted in individualism, in interest, and in rationality. And I think when you appeal to care, when feminists appeal to care, they're not just talking about care itself, but they're talking about a way of thinking that doesn't necessarily start with us as atomized individuals, but as relational beings embedded in communities and families. The problem with care is it seems, at least on its face, to have a narrower compass. And it's interesting, you talk about groups, and because of what's going on in the Mideast and Libya right now, I was thinking about, I can think of a place right now where there's a real care ethic that's overriding everything else. I mean, this is absurd, but I think actually from what I know it's real. The Gaddafi clan. They're hunkering down together, they care deeply about each other, they're rejecting every other person, but it's a very strong group norm. That's an exaggerated view of what one might call the possible parochialism of care, that we feel care strongly in the family, in the clan, in the tribe. As it gets more distant, it's hard for that affect to have the same international and globalizing effect that the projection of rational self-interest does.
What shifts the paradigm that care rests on, why care was, in my view, a different voice, not just another voice within the old paradigm, but a different voice, is it starts with a premise of interdependence. So it's, exactly, aligned with the idea of interdependence. Now, I just want to make 2 or 3 comments in passing and then see if this would help the discussion. The first is that in the liberal state, one reason that caring was more or less invisible is that the people who did the caring were invisible. They were without voices. They had no public representation. They were women and the poor, basically. So the liberation of women brought to the general public political arena questions that had been remarkably absent, which is, does anybody care? Because if not, the sort of extreme position is, we're not going to do it if nobody cares. And if we're going to do it, we're going to raise these issues on a societal, political, global, economic level.
I think that one has to say that care and justice are not opposed values, and the individual considered as a right-bearing individual and the individual as a subject of care are not opposed values. There is absolutely no need as modern individuals, and also as modern men and women, for us to so segregate and segment ourselves also, to say one gender is associated with one point of view, which you are not absolutely doing. But I also am not ready to give up the language of rights and the language of politics. I consider that fundamental achievements of modernity. So whatever feminism we have has to be, you know, a feminism that is also true to those achievements.
But I'm not either. And this whole paper is on international law, which we hardly talk about at all. Human rights are part of that. So I'm not suggesting that we can substitute this point of view of care for something like the respect for rights, but I am trying to deal with the problem of what are the implications and how do they fit together.
In what I see in your work, this what I have read, which is opening up a problematic, not solving it, let's put it that way. But one way of thinking about it is opening conceptual ground or undisciplined ground to a disciplining, you know, because that comes back to the ethics. So it's not just the action of caring, it is actually finding a norm of sorts, right? Now, and it resonates with the work that I'm doing, which has to do with systems where the question of care doesn't appear. But I think there is a kind of a structural resonance between what you are saying and what I'm after. So for instance, in the environmental question, I mean, one way of putting it very succinctly is this rupture that we keep making, where the biosphere keeps circulating. Now we can think of this rupture as a cutting out of this caring norm. You know, so we restrict it just to the family or whatever, rather than trying to expand it globally or whatever it might be, or to other domains.
The goal is to deal with the problems, and they're very often problems that are best seen as problems of care. People are suffering environmental damages, or there are not going to be things that people need available to them, that kind of thing. So you can interpret them in terms of care, or, I mean, other language could be used, but it's certainly compatible with the values of care.
If what we really want to do is prevent violent conflict, we could benefit from approaching it as a problem in public health and doing empirical research to discover the etiology of suicide, homicide, accidents, and warfare, and attempting to do more than just care for the victims, but I'd say something that goes deeper than care, and that is prevention. That is preventing people from being injured in the first place so that they don't need medical care. That is not I mean, that's, of course, an enterprise based on moral norms. That is on the norm that we place a positive value on human life and that we place a positive value on protecting people from death that's avoidable. But it can proceed in a much more empirical manner, and is not simply a question of kind of how should people live together, but rather how can people live together. That is, what principles and policies, social and psychological, sustain life and which ones lead to death.
So far, what I've heard sort of the conversation being about are three entities: feminism, care, and interdependence. And it seems to me that these all have a common problem, and I would put it in the form of a question, what the problem is. Carol, you said it's a paradigm shift, and I totally agree with this fact. But how does one accomplish a paradigm shift? I mean, how do you do that? You know, I mean, I think this is a problem inherent, a continuing problem in feminism. It's an inherent problem in the interdependence movement, and it's obviously a problem in this question of the ethics of care and responsibility.
In terms of care, all I can come up with or came up with was that there would not be necessarily any kind of description that even the people around this room would all agree to that has to do with care, because it's an experiential response and it's also an emotional response. And so you've got those two things side by side. And then I look at, in order to get to this more frankly, idealistic world that I believe Virginia has described, then I have to take the issue of care, and I think the assumption she made that we have an experience of growing up with people who cared about us, and we experience that issue of care. And my concern is that there are a lot of people who haven't, and even those, and it's very likely that those people aren't going to be the ones who are going to be engendering this leadership role that exudes care.
As Ben was pointing out, one of the very important aspects of what's going on in the Middle East is the degree of nonviolence that's sort of coloring what's happening. And it seems to me that that's a very hopeful development, that for the U.S. to push hard that these governments you have a lot of restraint and allow for peaceful demonstrations without shooting people. If that becomes more the standard practice, you could avoid quite a lot of the violence that has occurred. When you say the violent conflict is sort of more interstate violence is maybe more a thing of the past. The U.S. invasion of Iraq was not that long ago, and an awful lot of people got killed. And so it's importantly in my mind when I'm trying to write about these things. It could easily happen again, it seems to me. And to Leah's point about whether you use power to bring about this change, or you can use something like practices of care to try to influence power. I like the way Stuart put it, that it's not one or the other. They can reinforce one another. I think a certain amount of change has occurred in recognizing some of the considerations that an ethic of care would bring to the fore. I think one of the great advantages of the ethics of care is that it does not invoke religion, require religion. Everybody has experienced care. Everybody can get reflective about the values inherent in caring practices. Everybody needs care, and can see that from a moral point of view, there ought to be care for those who need it, and you can get something like human rights out of this, that every child that needs care ought to get it, and that can go quite a long way towards providing at least recommendations about how to deal with some problems that the world is facing. How do you get there? Well,
that would be a long answer.
what?
Or we all have to think about it.
Or it could be a very short answer.
Or a very short one, right? It's a problem.
Well, why don't we thank Virginia?
Thank you for